Great. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Thank you so much for participating via the chat box and telling us a little bit of what programs you have and where you're from. As you can see, there are a lot of different programs and there are a lot of different participants throughout the country, which highlights the importance of this webinar and this topic of really diving into effective collaborations between anti-trafficking programs and domestic violence programs. So just for some housekeeping, we do have closed captioning today. You will see a button that says CC at the bottom of your screen. If you would like closed captioning, please go ahead and click on that button. We're also adding a link on the chat box that will open up a separate browser screen, so that way you can have those at the same time, and you can have two different screens with that. So feel free to go ahead and turn that on as it may be useful to you. We will be taking questions and have some time for questions and answers at the end, but please go ahead and use your chat box as those come up. Just know that there may be different sections that are going to answer the questions you may have. And for those that we may not have answered, we'll have some time at the end to be able to dive into some of those. For the people who did submit questions with your registration, thank you very much. Those have been shared with the panelists, and they'll be able to incorporate and highlight some of those answers and potential ideas for you. So we just want to make that available for you all. And then finally, and we'll say this at the end, we will be having a follow-up call in April that will include the same panelists from today in order to address questions that are still left unanswered, or to explore some troubleshooting that you may still want or need as we address that collaboration between domestic violence programs and anti-trafficking programs. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We are the Freedom Network Training Institute. We are a training and technical assistance project, and one of the pieces that we take on is identifying and addressing assistance and access for housing for survivors of human trafficking. So as part of this project, we bring bi-monthly webinars on housing topics, especially as they relate to survivors of human trafficking. This is a very important project, and also the topics that we touch on today is obviously one of the pieces that we know is very important in being able to address that housing access for survivors. For today's call and for today's webinar, we have a fantastic panel set up. As you can see, and I'll tell you a little bit more about who our presenters are. We have a lot of expertise on the domestic violence side, as well as anti-trafficking, in really bringing and highlighting that collaboration. And so we'll really dive into how to make those collaborations successful. Darcy Flynn is the Associate Director for the Freedom from Trafficking at Heartland Human Care Services. Over the past 6 years, she's become a local and national expert on providing quality and trauma-informed services to survivors of human trafficking. Peg Hexelo is the founder and CEO of the National Alliance for Safe Housing, where she sees and oversees multiple innovative programs providing safe housing options for survivors of domestic violence, as well as sexual assault and their families. And finally, Sean Huang is the Associate Director of the Residential Programs at Womankind, and there she provides support to survivors of human trafficking, of gender-based violence, including domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as she oversees the daily operations of 2 emergency facilities. So as you can tell, we have a lot of expertise, and really we'll have a well-rounded conversation on some of the key aspects of developing those effective collaborations and addressing some of the challenges that we know exist today. So from the screen, you can see what the goals are, but really we want to take the approach of understanding what the domestic violence shelter system looks like, especially as an option of survivors of human trafficking. We know that this is an option, a housing option that most anti-trafficking providers have had experience with or have tried to access in the past, whether successfully or with challenges. So we really want to tackle the question and the idea of, is this an option, and to what extent, is it a fit for survivors, and taking that individual lens in that approach of collaboration. We'll also be exploring what are some of the general requirements to accessing domestic violence shelters, especially for anti-trafficking or programs and survivors of human trafficking where they may not necessarily present as a survivor of domestic violence. And so we want to be very clear and highlight that. We'll be sharing examples of successful collaboration between anti-trafficking programs and domestic violence programs. And finally, some methods that you can use to advocate for the needs of human trafficking survivors as they seek to access those domestic violence programs and shelters. So to get a sense of where this group is at and our attendees, we would love to know how familiar you are with your local domestic violence shelter. We're going to launch a poll. If you could just add to that. If you are a domestic violence shelter, you can go ahead and say we have successful collaboration, because obviously we're trying to collaborate with you all, and so this will be extremely helpful. So go ahead, and we're going to take 1 minute. Just give us a sense of where you're at. How familiar are you already with your local domestic violence shelter or program? Okay, we're going to give it just 1 more second, and we'll go ahead and show the results so you can all tell as well. So from what you're seeing is most have a successful collaboration. There's another percentage that have referred to domestic violence shelters in the past. A lesser number know the name of their shelter, and to a lesser extent, somebody does not, or a percentage of people do not know where a DV shelter is. So that's great. There is room to explore and to have this conversation for all of these categories, for all these groups, and we want to be able to add to what you're already doing. And as we go through the conversation, as we go through these sections, we want to hear what's working for you. So in addition to asking questions on what challenges may be happening, feel free to use that chat box as you hear presenters discuss different options to let us know if there's something that's being used in your local area or region that's been useful, because it does help for other programs and for us to be familiarized with what is working that maybe we're not aware of. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start with really framing out what the domestic violence shelter system and movement looks like, and that's going to be Peg. She's going to go ahead and take us through that part of the program.
Hi, thank you, Karen. Can you all hear me? Well, I will dive in. As Karen introduced me, my name is Peg Haskalow, and I'm the founder and CEO of NASH, the National Alliance for Safe Housing. If you could move to the next frame, please. Thank you. So NASH's mission is to create a world where safe housing is a right shared by everyone through improved access, increased resources, and innovative solutions. So that's sort of a big way of saying that we're really focused on providing training and technical assistance at the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and homelessness and housing, with the sort of specific purpose of ensuring that survivors of domestic and sexual violence don't become homeless as a result of the violence or the victimization that they've experienced. So that's what NASH is about. You can go to the next frame, please. So I'm going to provide a little bit of context about the evolution of the domestic violence shelter movement so that you all have a sense, it sounds like many of you already do, of how shelter programs have developed over the years. So the domestic violence shelter, what used to be known as battered women's shelter movement, started really in the 1970s out of the second wave of the feminist movement. So it really came from mainstream feminist movement, an effort by individuals to provide a network of safe homes for survivors of domestic violence to run to when they needed a safe place to go, because there weren't really at that time any laws, programs, or protections in place for survivors to find safety or redress from violence. So when shelters developed, they really developed out of this network of informally run safe homes. And they were designed to provide immediate safety and refuge for survivors and their children. So they started out with some basic expectations. One, that facilities be in confidential locations that were expected to be kept secret for residents' safety and the safety of everyone who was living in shelters. And that's a condition that has really remained with many shelters to this day. Facilities also often developed out with a communal style shelter. So they had shared living arrangements, shared dining, kitchen areas, oftentimes shared bedrooms. And you can imagine that that was usually because of the need for cost efficiency and to be able to help a lot of survivors at one time. You can go to the next frame, please. So, but the way that these shelter programs developed, they also employed some of the techniques that were popular in that time, like consciousness raising. And this was support groups that were designed to educate survivors about domestic violence and help really raise their awareness around institutionalized gender-based violence and oppression. So these programs were trying to create communities of survivors who could heal and grow together and understand how domestic violence was a symptom of the broader gender-based violence that happens in our society. There were also expectations for shared responsibility for survivors to help take care of the shelter and really be able to give back to the community and demonstrate self-sufficiency. So in a lot of shelter programs, and this is true today too, you'll see that residents are expected to help cook a meal for all the residents in the program one night a week. They may be asked to do chores in the shelter in order to help maintain the program. And that was really, again, came out of the idea of creating a sense of community within the shelter. Lengths of stay were usually 30 to 90 days maximum, and that is typically true for domestic violence shelters today. And because the programs were designed to help survivors recover from crisis, it wasn't really focused on, long-term housing for survivors. The focus was really more on victim services and collaborating with other systems to help survivors move on from shelter after their maximum stay. So over time, a lot of the programs developed a variety of services in order to address survivors' needs. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see that there's a wide variety of the kinds of services that shelters have developed over time. Not every shelter offers all of these services. But many shelters offer many of these, like legal advocacy or children's programs or case management or language access. So it really varies from shelter to shelter as to the services that they offer. Next slide. Thanks. So I think the thing that I want to point out is that as the domestic violence shelter movement evolved, it became, if you will, legitimized. So the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act was passed in 1984. And that was the first funding to provide, or the first funding through the federal government for domestic violence shelters. And that came through the Department of Health and Human Services. The Victims of Crime Act was passed that same year, which provided funding through the Office for Victims of Crime. The Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994, and that provided funding for shelters under the Office on Violence Against Women. So, and then in addition to that, there were many new laws that were passed to provide protections for survivors and legal redress for the abuse that they've experienced. So over time, with these new protections and new funding, and what came with it was a lot of increased research and evidence around what works to help survivors recover from violence. There was also a great deal of professionalization of services, and all of that really has an impact on the way that shelters operate, and really necessitated in a way for shelters to become more narrowly focused on survivors' individual safety and empowerment rather than on the broadly driven goals around consciousness raising and understanding systemic oppression. Next slide, please. But over time, we have come to appreciate that that narrow focus on safety and individual empowerment and to some degree perpetrator accountability really misses out on the many dimensions and intersections that survivors of domestic and sexual violence are having to deal with. And so in the last few years, we have begun to develop what we call the understanding of safe housing, which really incorporates an understanding that domestic and sexual violence impacts a broad range of survivors, that it's not just one kind of survivor who needs support and services, that it results in a variety of complicated needs, and it really is the primary cause of homelessness for survivors and their families. And so therefore, we believe that survivors require more nuanced approaches. And so with that, if you go to the next slide, please. We've developed what we call the array of safe housing options. And this is how we envision really being able to address survivors' safe housing needs. So we break it down into three sort of buckets. The first being emergency shelter, and that is the home of all of the domestic violence shelters that evolved over the years. There are something on the order of 3,000 shelter programs across the country now. And as I said, most of those shelters are designed to provide crisis response and safety, and generally focus on confidentiality and advocacy and helping survivors figure out their options for once they leave shelter. The next bucket is transitional housing, and that's something that has evolved more since OVW provided transitional housing funding back in 2004. And those programs are typically 6 to 24 months long and really designed to help survivors recover and stabilize from the crisis that they have experienced. Those programs also might provide financial assistance, employment support, other specialized services. So it's really a longer term interim housing solution for survivors. And then the third bucket is permanent housing. And that is again designed to provide survivors with long-term housing and economic stability, and might include rapid rehousing services. That might take a housing first approach. Typically is designed to be affordable, might provide support with home purchase assistance. So there's a variety of housing options in the universe of safe housing, all of it undergirded by safety planning, advocacy, and access to trauma-informed services. So, and the thing that I always am careful to provide, to mention here, is that this isn't a linear progression. It's not often that survivors go from emergency shelter to transitional housing to permanent housing. They might go straight to transitional and skip shelter altogether. They might go into permanent housing and skip the first two. They might not need to go into housing at all and can be supported to remain safe in the community with financial assistance. So the idea is to really think broadly about what survivors' housing needs are and help address them in the way that makes the most sense for them. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about access and eligibility to shelters and help provide, now that you have some context for how shelters developed, provide some understanding of the kinds of eligibility criteria that shelters employ and how to strategically address those. So next slide, please. So there are three basic eligibility criteria that shelters most often use when they're setting up their eligibility criteria. And those are that the applicant be a victim of intimate partner violence, that they be in imminent danger of abuse, or that they be at imminent risk of homelessness. And it really varies from program to program as to whether all three of those conditions apply. Some programs only employ two of the three. It's really going to be up to the program as to how they set out those eligibility criteria. The thing that I want to note here is that this may or may not be contingent on the funding source that the shelter receives. The three main shelter federal funding sources, a couple of which I've mentioned, FIPSA and the Violence Against Women Act, typically, so those two funding sources typically do require that participants in shelter programs be victims of intimate partner violence, so escaping abuse or violence from a partner or a boyfriend or ex-boyfriend. It doesn't have to be opposite sex, it could be same sex. In recent years, they have broadened their eligibility to include ex-partners, so former partners where there's been stalking involved, as well as male survivors of violence by female partners. So it has become a little bit more flexible, but VAWA and FIPSA do require that there be intimate partner violence involved. HUD has also expanded their definition of what qualifies someone as homeless, and they have typically included that the person be at imminent, fleeing domestic violence. So it doesn't have to be imminent danger, but that someone has escaped a domestic violence situation, or that they're at imminent risk of homelessness. So living in a place that's not suited for human habitation. So as I was saying before, it really varies from a funding source to funding source as to what eligibility criteria programs would use. Next slide, please. And then there are other screening factors that programs might include that may or may not be best practice as we would think of it, but I thought that it was important for everyone to understand that, that there often are these kinds of screening factors put into place. So some programs require that there not be a history of substance abuse, or that the participant be sober, or that they be receiving treatment for medical or mental health issues, not be a threat to themselves or others. Some programs require the applicant to be a resident of their local jurisdiction. Some programs require that the survivor have children or don't accept single women. Other programs specifically accept single women. Some programs dictate that they won't accept adult children or adolescent sons or other family members that aren't dependents on the survivor who's the primary victim. So these, as I was saying, may be requirements that are coming from funders, not federal funders, but keep in mind that many shelter programs also receive local funding dollars through foundations or local governments who may be stipulating some of these conditions. And the other thing to remember is that programs may be perceiving these conditions to be dictated by funders, and that those conditions are no longer requirements by the funder. A lot of times, certain screening factors or rules stay in place in long-time programs, even though they've been abolished by the funder or the government. Next slide, please. So then additional screening factors might include no pets unless they're service animals, a willingness to keep the shelter location secret. As I mentioned, confidentiality of location is something that many shelters still require, although in recent years we've seen more and more shelters willing to make their location, to divulge the location and use a great deal of security to ensure the safety of the people in the shelter. There may be requirements to agree to participate in shelter programs such as support groups or resume writing programs, that sort of thing. There may be a requirement for full or part-time employment of participants, or a willingness to put a percentage of their income into escrow savings, to have valid identification, or that the participant be a legal resident alien or U.S. citizen. So again, we may not consider many of these factors to be best practice. In fact, one of the things that NASH has been working on is really supporting programs to release some of these factors and understand how they can serve survivors using a more flexible, what we think of as a low barrier approach. But it is important to be aware that shelters might have these in place. And that's why we have this webinar. So next slide, please. And then finally, I thought it would be helpful to just understand the process for admission, so that as advocates for survivors of trafficking, you understand how that process goes, and that you can really help broker for the survivor with the domestic violence shelter to help them gain access to the program. So it typically starts with an intake or a hotline call. Some programs employ a visit so that you can meet with somebody in an office setting. Typically, they will review the situation of abuse and history. They might conduct a lethality assessment to determine the level of risk and potentially homicide risk that a survivor is facing. They will go through the eligibility criteria to determine if the survivor fits their eligibility. They might do safety planning with the survivor, particularly for shelters that may not have space but are willing to put the survivor on a waiting list. They might help her do safety planning for while she's preparing to get into the shelter at a later date. They would go over the rules of the shelter and make sure that she agrees to abide by those rules. Again, we have really been working with a lot of shelter programs, as has one of our colleagues, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, to help shelters use a more voluntary services approach, which has really allowed them to use fewer rules in their programs. They might go over initial program expectations, and then there would be the process for transportation to shelter. So for many shelters, they might, because they're in a confidential location, require new residents to go to a meeting place where they can then be given instructions for how to get to the shelter. This is really designed to make sure that they're not followed and that they come to the shelter safely and confidentially. So that's what I had, and I think you'll learn a lot more about how to work with and develop relationships and work with domestic violence shelters. So I'm going to hand it over now to Darcy.
Thanks so much, Peg. Hi, everyone. I'm Darcy Flynn from Heartland Alliance in Chicago. Coming off of Peg's great presentation, I'm just reminded that there's such an opportunity here to collaborate and adjust and adhere to some of these best practices. It's not going to happen overnight, but so I'm here today because I wear a few different hats, and I'm fortunate to have a local, regional, and national perspective in the work that I do. So we provide comprehensive case management to foreign-born survivors of human trafficking in the Chicagoland area, but we also help to co-administer the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, or TVAP, nationally with service providers, many of whom may be on the call today, to provide that case management to survivors of trafficking who are foreign-born. And then I also oversee an OVC project, OVC-funded project that's more capacity building that I'll talk about in a moment. And so I have the opportunity to work alongside wonderful domestic violence and/or sexual assault providers. And so today I'm really here to talk about my experience in working with these partners, but I know there are a lot of domestic violence providers on the call, and you are all much more the expert than I am in that movement or that field. So I just wanted to give that caveat of kind of here's what we've learned locally and how I've kind of helped to support regional and national efforts as well. So if you go to the next slide. So we wanted to really kind of just remind folks that we are kind of talking about this in buckets and trying to kind of break down silos. So there's domestic violence, there's sexual assault, there's human trafficking. But what we know is these survivors are often victims of multiple crimes or traumas, and those traumas may have happened over a span of their lifetime. So perhaps they experienced child sexual abuse, and then fast forward 20 years and then they were trafficked. And so it's just important to keep in mind that polyvictimization does happen, and how a survivor is presenting to your office is likely due to the fact that you're funded to serve that trauma. So you're funded to serve domestic violence, therefore they've come to you because someone or themselves have identified them as a domestic violence victim. Or they're receiving services from you because you're funded to serve survivors of trafficking and they're presenting as a survivor of trafficking. But because we're so kind of head down, we're checking the boxes of our funding, it's easy to forget these other polyvictimizations. And they may actually identify more with a different trauma or crime committed against them than the one that you're funded to serve. And so we're funded to be experts in domestic violence, or we're funded to be experts in trafficking, but it's important to really remember their experiences are on a spectrum in terms of their trauma. And this is important when creating a service plan, creating a safety plan, talking about what your services are. I don't always say I'm a social worker and I work with victims of trafficking because that doesn't always resonate with people. So just keep that in mind. And because we know polyvictimization happens, the abuser or perpetrator may be multiple people, it may be an intimate partner, it may be a family member, it may be a stranger. They may have, all of these individuals may have abused them at some point in their life. And so it's really just important to think about that intersectionality when also kind of going back and perhaps looking at some of the eligibility criteria or screening criteria that Peg has just shared with us as well. So next slide. So how are we, or how can you, if you're not already, how can we cross-collaborate? How can we kind of start to break down these silos? First and foremost, if you are not a domestic violence provider, I really highly recommend tapping into your domestic violence coalition. these are typically at the state level, but not everywhere. And there are kind of smaller coalitions or committees or task forces as well in communities, but a lot of the coalitions are at the state level if you're looking to find yours. Offer cross-training opportunities. Reach out and say, hey, can I train you on trafficking? And I would love to hear more about your work and how to identify domestic violence and how domestic violence kind of intersects with trauma and how that manifests. It's just a great opportunity to have a dialogue and tap into what they know and share what you know as well. I am a firm believer that we learn from our mistakes, and I feel like everything I've done in my career has been because I did it wrong the first time. And so in one of the capacities that I operate in, I had the opportunity to train our domestic violence coalition. So all of the members of the coalition are respective domestic violence agencies throughout the state, and I had the opportunity to come in and do a half-day training on human trafficking, and I was super excited. And I walked in that room assuming everyone was aligned, everyone understood. Of course, I get how trafficking and domestic violence intersect. Of course, I understand that we have to work together, and I walked in with those assumptions. I didn't walk in remembering or acknowledging that the state of Illinois had just come out of a 2.5-year budget crisis in which domestic violence programs were significantly impacted, negatively impacted. I didn't come or acknowledge that they have been doing this work in terms of working with survivors of trafficking much longer than the anti-trafficking movement. And so very quickly during my presentation, I was getting a lot of pushback and a lot of questions around, well, why are you here in the first place? We're already doing this. And so it was a really great opportunity for me to just pause and really have a dialogue about, well, what are you doing as a domestic violence movement, and how can we supplement, or how can we, as a anti-trafficking service provider, fill gaps? So, I took a step back and ended up asking the questions is, what services do they offer? What do we offer? Are there gaps amongst us, even though, two kind of different providers are coming together? How do these services look differently? And we really started to break down into the nitty-gritty. And that was a much fruitful conversation. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge or share how I started to jump into this and then learned my lesson, admittedly the hard way. It's also important to kind of understand, we kind of throw out this term case management. Well, we provide case management. Well, what does that actually look like? We provide at Heartland case management, and so many of our partners provide case management, and it looks very different. Ours is very intensive. Any need the survivor has, we try to or able to meet that need in the community. We accompany to appointments. We find housing. We really do a lot of hands-on case management, whereas other programs perhaps don't have the capacity to be so intensive. So just asking, what do you do? And the answer being case management often is not enough. You really kind of have to dig in and ask more questions about what those services look like. And again, how do they differ? Going to my previous slide around polyvictimization, it is important to identify all the victimizations, because if you kind of stop with identifying domestic violence and don't uncover trafficking if it does exist, that may close the door for resources for that survivor, as well as immigration relief if we're talking about foreign-born. So being able to identify their victimizations may actually open up resources and services that they qualify for by nature, because that's how our funding works, right? If you say you're domestic violence, you get X. If you say you're trafficking, you get Y. And so we want to make sure they're not missing out on anything. There are also policy opportunities when it comes to cross-collaboration. This area, at least locally, and I've also noticed this nationally, is super siloed. There's the laws being proposed and passed to protect domestic violence survivors, and then there's the ones over here proposed or passed to serve or protect human trafficking survivors, and there's such an overlap. So find out who in your community is advocating and lobbying on behalf of domestic violence survivors and or human trafficking survivors, depending on kind of what what lane you're in currently. Get to know them, talk to them about your work, teach them about human trafficking, or bring people who know about trafficking to the table. What are their goals for the upcoming legislative session? Are there areas to kind of tag on or tack on human trafficking if they're focusing on domestic violence? We've done that here locally in Chicago or in Illinois. From a policy standpoint, we passed it went into effect in 2018, the most progressive public benefits bill in the country to provide public benefits to undocumented survivors pursuing a T visa, U visa, or asylum. And we didn't just offer it to trafficking survivors because we heard from our partners in the domestic violence field, especially, that their survivors needed this too. And so we were able to kind of do a joint policy effort around that. And then funding opportunities. These are few and far between sometimes, it feels like, or they're very siloed, but there are starting to be opportunities where you can kind of do a collective program model where you can serve both domestic violence and trafficking survivors. We have done that with some VOCA dollars locally to do transitional housing. On our COC, Continuum of Care, we've started, and this is in large part due to HUD's commitment to this and investment in this, but we've been able to make sure our Continuum of Care is not just talking about domestic violence, but also human trafficking, especially around like category 4, fleeing violence. And so it's just important to know, again, who are your partners and how are they talking about this work? And then if you have a human trafficking task force in your community, funded or not, are your domestic violence partners at the table? If not, invite them, have them come and train the task force. That would be a really great opportunity to start kind of bridging those gaps. And so you can go to the next slide. So when you do kind of get to know your domestic violence partners, if you're a trafficking agency or working with trafficking survivors, I hope you're not trafficking people, you should start off by kind of understanding their process. We have to do that here locally. Chicago's pretty big, so we have a couple different processes and every shelter is different, but something that we did initially was figure out what the experience is like when a survivor calls the domestic violence hotline that then triages out to domestic violence shelters if there's a housing need. And we did this because time and time again, we would call with a survivor and they would be told, you don't meet the eligibility criteria. And we were kind of in the thick of it. The survivor was on the phone, and so it was harder to kind of backpedal or advocate or figure out what they were asking. And so we went back and talked to kind of leaders who oversee the hotline to better understand what they're looking for, what they are going to ask. And we had one case in particular, she's a labor trafficking survivor. But there was a part of her kind of recruitment, how she was recruited, and some of her fact pattern, there was a coerced, but albeit a romantic relationship with her trafficker. But for a lot of reasons, you know, she felt shame about that. She didn't actually want to be in a relationship with this person. So when she called the hotline, she didn't say the things that indicated intimate partner violence. Because it wasn't how she was experiencing her trauma or understanding her trauma. But when we kind of went back and spoke to the hotline, they helped us kind of know the language to use. And I'm not saying lie and stretch the story to make it fit, but instead it's knowing your survivor's story and helping them frame it in a way, if it does fit, so that they're not turned away. And so in that case, she was able to access the domestic violence shelter because she did have, there was a romantic relationship involved in her trafficking story. Also sometimes, or oftentimes they require how long ago have they been interacting with their perpetrator. And for her, she hadn't seen him in a long time and longer than the requirement to meet the eligibility criteria. However, she left out that he had been texting her multiple times a week. And so that counted as contact. And so again, that opened the door for entry into a domestic violence shelter, whereas it wouldn't have to begin with. So just understanding what the process is to access these services. Oftentimes when we explain options to survivors, they say, well, what does the shelter look like? What is it gonna be like? And so if you can, ask for a tour of the shelter with or without the survivor. Oftentimes they don't let the survivor come and tour just because of confidentiality, but they may allow you as staff to do a tour based on your own schedule. So then you can at least say, you know, there are 4 rooms, each room has X amount of beds, there's a communal kitchen, whatever it is you observe, you can then kind of paint that picture for the survivor. Understand the rules that the domestic violence shelter has, because it may be a make or break for the survivor. For example, if they say you can't have any cell phone on your person when you're in the shelter, that may be a big safety risk for the survivor, because they won't be able to contact their attorney, their therapist, their safety net, whoever it is. So that's just one example of what are the rules and is it a make or break for the survivor. And then if you do make a referral, I highly recommend scheduling regular case consults with the staff at that domestic violence shelter to include or not include the survivor. I think some meetings make sense to include the survivor and some may not, but making sure you're all on the same page, you're communicating regularly, and you're not duplicating efforts. It's important that the survivor knows whose role or who's doing what and what each kind of provider's role is. And case consults are a great vehicle to make that happen. So you can go to the next slide. So again, is the referral a good fit? I don't think we should assume the answer is yes, and that's okay. And so I think sometimes people think, well, the domestic violence shelters are the most trauma informed in the community, so that's where they have to go. But it may not be a good fit. And again, that's okay. It may mean that some more collaboration needs to take place. Maybe there's an opportunity to adhere to some of these best practices that Peg shared earlier. But these are just some questions to think about. Do they actually want to be in a domestic violence shelter? Maybe they don't, right? Maybe they don't identify enough with that kind of fact pattern or part of their victimization or trauma. Does the shelter or provider have services in the language that the survivor speaks or have access to a language line? So often they don't have any non-English or Spanish speaking capacity, and we serve survivors from over 20 countries. And so it's not just English or Spanish. And again, if you can't speak to the people who are providing you services, it's really hard to feel safe and to kind of become independent and self-sufficient. What services are available, and is it what the survivor actually needs? If a lot of services are mandated, whether it's groups or therapy, maybe that's not what the survivor needs, and so they won't be able to participate and therefore they won't qualify. What can you as an anti-trafficking program continue to offer? So again, what are you supplementing? What are you duplicating? What does that look like? I already mentioned the rules and policies. And then are they actually trained on trafficking? Do they understand the kind of nuances of trafficking, especially if there's any sort of law enforcement or investigation happening? Trafficking investigations look very different than a domestic violence investigation from a legal criminal justice standpoint. So again, it's another opportunity to cross-train and to build up that capacity for the provider. You can go to the next slide. So again, it's okay if it's not a good fit. It may be an opportunity for a conversation, but some of these reasons, and this is not an exhaustive list, but length of stay, these are reasons why it's often not a good fit for our survivors. Locally, we have about a 90 to 120 day rule with no exceptions. We know currently for undocumented survivors, they're not going to have any sort of legal status for 18 to 24 plus months, just with how long immigration is taking right now. And we know that given the way the housing system is structured in the US, legal status really matters and opens doors for longer term housing placements or services. So that's just one example. Human trafficking survivors are also often displaced and isolated. That's kind of part of their trafficking situation, especially foreign born. And so they may be in a community where they literally don't know anyone, they don't know where they are, they don't know the community. Not to say this doesn't happen with domestic violence survivors, but it's very common with trafficking survivors. And so having to navigate how to get out of shelter and live independently in 90 to 120 days is really, really hard, and probably won't happen. And so what we want to try to avoid is a survivor who now has a domestic violence shelter stay, then goes to a homeless shelter, and then maybe ends up at another homeless shelter because they just keep moving on once that 120 days is up. That's not trauma-informed, it's not ideal, and it's not safe for survivors of trauma. We've also had shelters who are really focused on employment because, of course, we know that being able to support yourself and pay for your own housing requires a job, requires income. And our undocumented survivors are put in a really tough position where at the shelter, they're being told you have to look for a job, you have to work, but it actually could jeopardize their immigration case. They may not be ready to work depending on what's happening with their trauma. They may need some significant job training and even just how to build a resume when your only work experience has been your trafficking situation. And so you probably should not put your trafficker as your only reference on your resume. These are nuanced things that if the shelter staff don't understand trafficking, that's not going to be clear when making a service plan. And then I referenced this earlier, but they're not always culturally or linguistically appropriate. And that may be a make or break for a survivor in terms of their safety and well-being while they're in the care of that shelter. So you can go to the next slide. So finally, I just wanted to share what I think is, in my unbiased opinion, a really exciting opportunity that we've had over the past 3 years to build capacity with partners in the community who do domestic violence, sexual assault, and actually elder abuse work in their respective communities. So in 2016, we applied for an Office for Victims of Crime grant, the Comprehensive Services Grant, for those of you who are familiar. And we applied as a pass-through agency and as a kind of support capacity building agent. So our subrecipients listed here, the Center for Prevention of Abuse in Peoria, Illinois, and the Kankakee County Center Against Sexual Assault in Iroquois and Kankakee counties, but located in Kankakee, Illinois. And we did this because these are two providers that we had relationships with, and we frequently heard from them that we know what's happening in our community, and two things are happening. One, we get referrals, but the survivors don't stick around because we can't offer them what they need. Again, there are gaps between what a domestic violence or sexual assault agency can provide and what a trafficking survivor needs. So that's one kind of thing they were observing. Or two, they weren't getting calls because people in their community didn't know what to look for. They didn't know what trafficking looked like. And so we saw an opportunity to, as an organization that has expertise with this population, to train up these organizations on what does trafficking look like, how do you identify it, and then how do you go out in your communities and help your community partners and key stakeholders identify trafficking. And then we didn't just want to say, go train everyone, and then hooray, now people are being identified, because we want to make sure they're connected to services once they're identified. And so we brought along the services. So these subrecipient agencies are able to provide comprehensive case management to those survivors once they're identified. And so we've been able to identify over 45 survivors collectively across the two communities. These are smaller communities with a lot of rural areas in their respective jurisdictions. So we see that as a really big win. And we've trained over, I'm trying to remember, at least over 1,200 people in these respective communities to identify trafficking. And one thing I want to point out is the Center for Prevention of Abuse is a domestic violence and sexual assault provider. And I would say probably roughly 90% of the referrals they have received have come internally from other staff in other departments within their organization. And so what does that tell us? It tells us survivors of trafficking were always walking in their door. They just weren't equipped to identify and then provide even more wraparound services, but now they are. And so we got creative with the funding. It's been a really fun project, and these two organizations are amazing. And so it's just been really neat to see an opportunity to, again, collaborate and train each other. They've taught me so much. I hope I've taught them a thing or two. They've learned about labor trafficking. Their communities have been able to think about how to serve foreign-born survivors, because that really hasn't been an area or a population that has been identified when it comes to victims of crime. So again, it's just been a really great capacity building opportunity, and I'm happy to answer more questions or talk offline about how we developed and implemented that project. So now I think I'm going to hand it over to Sean to talk about how are we going to advocate for the needs of survivors as we build out these collaborations. So I will hand it over.
Thank you so much, Darcy and Peg, for great coverage of the general DV shelter system and how successful collaboration looks like. Now, I will be covering for the last piece of this webinar. Again, this is Sean. In the past 5 years, I've been working in residential programs at Womankind. Womankind is a nonprofit in New York City providing linguistically and culturally appropriate services to survivors of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual violence, who are of Asian descent. Our two emergency residences, Peace House and Rose House, which I oversee the daily operations, are the only two licensed by New York State that are culturally and language equipped to serve Pan-Asian survivors of gender-based violence. I'm very excited to join this webinar as one of the presenters. I truly believe knowledge sharing between service providers is truly critical to support our survivors and support our work, but learning that we share the same passion and commitment of advocacy work is just something that can really help sustain ourselves in this field. So thanks for this opportunity. In this section, I will be sharing experience working with HT survivors coming to our residential program using trauma-informed and cultural sensitivity lens. You can move to the next slide. So first of all, to advocate the needs of human trafficking survivors, with DV shelters, networking is the key, because before we can even offer the services to meet the needs, we must have good understanding of the resources we have, what are the support and what are the limitations. So building that relationship with DV service providers and local providers can allow us to begin the process of advocating for our clients' needs. So in my experience, it is actually most effective if that networking is done before a crisis or incident arises. Participating in State's DV Coalition and shelter networks to engage ongoing dialogues of issues, or actively involved in strategic planning process is definitely helpful. But additionally, building a relationship with our local providers is a good way to obtain access to when services or shelter vacancies are available in certain programs, as well as better understanding in their specific criteria. Like Peg and Darcy both mentioned earlier, a successful advocacy requires community collaboration. Partnerships with law enforcement, medical, and mental health providers, immigration attorneys, and local ethnic groups are just some of the possible partners to work with in addressing the needs of human trafficking. And advocates may be able to join existing partnerships established in the community, such as domestic violence task force or sexual assault task force. But by all means, it is important that we collectively learn from and support one another. Next. Please, next slide. As service provider, we all know that primary role of an advocate is to support the survivors while advocating for the rights and helping them navigate through various societal structures such as the shelter and housing system or criminal justice system. Advocacy often includes efforts to identify the survivor's strengths and needs and acknowledging the survivor's own voice, respect to their own choice. Example in our shelter programs is we're intentionally using the language of this of voice that coming from the survivors. So in our residential program, we intentionally not to use shelter because the residents have voiced it out. They found that terminology or that word is negative. So we're using house or use residence to really acknowledge that community and ownership that voiced by the survivors. We also not using victims in our program. Instead, we either use clients or survivors. But also in our work, we hear the words abuser and perpetrator a lot. In recognizing that we are working with and for our communities, also recognizing that community members that have engaged in harming are also a part of our community. So we tend to use the word people or person who harmed. So traditional advocacy skills such as knowledge of confidentiality, the crisis response, safety planning, and safety navigation will remain relevant when working with trafficking survivors. Well, many of the trauma-informed survivor empowering approaches can also be helpful when working with survivors of human trafficking. So it is important to constantly provide trainings around trauma-informed practice for shelter staff on an ongoing basis. However, we do recognize there are often human trafficking specific services that survivors need to access through the shelter. The service providers working with HT survivors can work with DV shelters to make accommodations for clients by make the referral as a joint case between human trafficking serving agency and the shelter, or having case conference as part of a case transfer plan to make that transition more smoothly. In any way, human trafficking case management does not end once a survivor is placed in domestic violence shelter. Best practice for working with shelters can include transparency when respecting privacy and confidentiality. Shelter staff should be made aware of the frequency of appointments that a survivor may have outside of the shelter. So it is always helpful to provide transportation for the survivor. Also, shelter staff may not be aware of triggers when it comes to human trafficking. Example of this would be assigning chores to victim of domestic servitude, as certain chores may be triggering to those survivors. So shelter staff and human trafficking case managers should also discuss appropriateness of the survivor participating in shelter support group. Certain shelters make participation in group sessions a requirement. However, it may not always be appropriate for the survivor to participate in DV group sessions. And I was looking at the webinar chat, there is also mentioned about legally it may not be okay to have them participate in those sessions without the release of consent. So just be careful around that. Additionally, given the cultures that we work with, traditional services can be challenged by cultural norms or ways of understanding or dealing with pain, healing, and the relationship between an advocate and a survivor. So training around trauma-informed practice and cultural sensitivity and cultural appropriateness is critical in advocating the needs of human trafficking survivors. Next slide. Thank you. So building trust is important to any advocacy effort with survivors. As a way to build trust and protect safety and confidentiality, the advocate should make the client feel safe and comfortable. If the client is a good fit to use DV shelters for short-term housing, one of the things advocates can consider is working with the client for them to be prepared prepared for their stay in the DV shelter. A few considerations to discuss with clients are some of the shelter rules. Some of the DV shelters have numerous rules in order to ensure the safety of their clients. These rules, however, may re-traumatize a HT survivor. Sometimes it's helpful to explain the rationales behind and explore the flexibilities to support various needs without compromising the safety. So for example, the rules around confidentiality, which means survivors cannot disclose the physical location or disclose the identity of the shelter or the residents living the shelter to any outsiders. This can include them cannot bring any unauthorized individuals to the facility. There are also restrictions around FaceTiming, video chatting, taking pictures inside the shelter, etc. Sometimes a client may feel safe in a given geographic location, but the shelter may believe that proximity to family or friends can compromise the location confidentiality and can potentially lead to administrative discharge. However, if we explain this to our survivors, we must explain to using their cultural language. We have this case in one of our facility that an Indian survivor, they brought their cousin to our shelter because when she was meeting the cousin really need to use the restroom, and she thought that it was okay to bring her to the facility. And after that incident, although the shelter address was disclosed to the cousin, we had a long conversation about what confidentiality really means to the survivor and explain that the rationale behind, so the survivor can really understand, internalize the importance of the confidentiality. In that case, we didn't do administrative discharge, but just provide a contract reminder as example. So anti-trafficking service providers should develop relationship with domestic violence shelter in the area to ensure that clients' wishes can be respected and the supportive services and safety planning are still provided during their stay. Curfews, shelter have very strict curfew rules and which may pose barriers or challenges. Some survivors may have overnight work schedule without any official documents because of the legal status, they may work under the table. So in that case, if we can advocate that needs, the DV shelters can provide some flexibility in terms of extending curfew for the survivors. Shared communal space. Many shelters have a shared room setting. It is important to have a conversation with our survivors about what it looks like when they move into a shared space. How will that affect them, and do they have any concerns? Some programmatic expectations. Some shelters may require the survivors become involved in certain programs, for example, support group, communal activities. So explain that to the survivors. And also, some of the shelter, they require residents to taking turns cleaning as part of the ownership when they're living in the shelter. So having that open dialogue with the survivors to manage their expectations is important. I wanted to highlight if the shelter receives federal funding, they are obligated to provide language interpretation service under Title VI. We shouldn't lose any side of this right all clients have. However, we recognize navigating this capacity is not so simple, but it should be noted. But this law also has some limitations because the language interpretation cannot fully address the issues around communication and cultural. There are also religion, rituality, and other cultural values attached to the complications of communication and comfort. Other special needs, including is the shelter ADA accessible? If the survivor has physical disability and needs special accommodation, the service provider should verify that shelter has this in place. Does client have certain medical needs? If so, then should also be made clear at the beginning of the placement process to ensure that the facility can accommodate that needs of the client. Next slide, thank you. some of the considerations when using DV shelters. In New York City, DV shelters are able to take referrals at any time of the day or night. If the survivor has an urgent shelter need, a DV shelter may be a good option. Also, DV shelters are confidential, so pick up and drop off location for clients should be placed in advance, especially if multiple people are involved, such as law enforcement agency or service providers. DV shelters often have access to additional resources such as transitional housing, housing subsidy program, and employment that the survivor may also access during their shelter stay. And DV shelters do not specialize in working survivors of HT. However, service providers have that opportunity to collaborate and form partnerships with shelters, which can serve as cross-referrals as mentioned earlier. Survivor may need longer than 90 days in shelter due to immigration status or other case-related needs. So this is also possibilities to advocate extensions. In New York City, although the initial length of stay is 90 days, but if the clients have immediate needs and then there is a progress of the case, then this advocate can advocate for more extensions, which can extend their shelter stay up to 180 days. DV shelter will likely need to do their own intake, which means the survivor may need to retell the story. So service providers can explore having a release of information signed by the survivor. That can provide necessary information for the intake and minimize potential re-traumatization. So at the end of my section, I'm gonna go over a case study that is currently in our residential program that has been, successful. So I wanted to share this with you guys. I named it Sandy's case. So Sandy's case was referred to Womankind by the Department of Labor seeking safe housing. Sandy came to United States in 1966 as a domestic helper for the employer, but she was not treated fairly. She was not given the great salary that she was supposed to get when she was recruited to work for them. Sandy's contract stated that she was supposed to get supposed to get paid $200 per month, but she was only given $20 per month upon arrival in the States. In the mid-1990s, her salary was raised to $50 per month. But since 2016, she hasn't getting paid at all. Additionally, Sandy's physical movement was restricted, and she was not allowed to go out without her employer's presence. So she stayed with her employer in the same apartment, working for him, experiencing long-term verbal and physical abuse. Sandy experienced multiple mental breakdowns and felt distressed by her situation. But she couldn't get help because she felt shamed by the situation, and then she didn't know what resources she have. So at the end of last year, Sandy finally decided to move out of the apartment and flee the abuse from her employer. Sandy also wanted to receive counseling to heal from trauma. One of our HT advocate in Womankind assessed Sandy's case that there is overlap in HT and DV and referred Sandy to our residential programs. Soon after she moved in our residence, Sandy was able to establish a full public assistance case and was able to receive cash assistance, Medicaid, food stamps for herself. She constantly met with our advocate on a weekly basis to process her feelings. She also utilized our space for healing by participating like knitting group, various awareness activities to really engage healing process. During her stay, she also complete NOVA screening, which she got the domestic violence priority for public housing. So she really utilized that her trauma experience to actually advocate for her needs. Sandy also worked closely with her advocate exploring senior housing and affordable housing options. So until now, she has been with us for more than 3 months. She continued her healing journey with us, and we hope that she can secure permanent housing, so can she move forward with her life after moving our programs. So in her case, you see a lot of challenges in terms of like she had to reply the legal documents. She has to, there are a lot of medical needs and housing barriers because of the age, and she also has some impaired hearing issues. So the physical and medical needs is very unique in her case. But through her shelter stay, by participating various awareness activities, by providing her adaptive counseling services, we really see her progress she made every single day. And we really, we found the healing space that we offered to her as truly amazing. So I just wanted to mention this case. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I might not cover every single thing I remember, but yeah, if you have any questions, please type in the chat box and we can respond.
Great. Thank you so much, Shonda. It's extremely helpful. So we have a little less than 15 minutes, and we have gotten a lot of questions that we're really excited to be able to answer. So just to let you know, we probably be able to take about 3 or 4 questions today, but we want to let you know that we are having the follow-up technical assistance call, and we'll send the registration link for that. That's going to be in April, but we will be sending out the registration link within the week with the follow-up email for this. So the first question that we want to address, Darcy, you're going to get us started, is how do you address the concern about recruitment within domestic violence shelters if people are bringing in, or if domestic violence shelters are taking in human trafficking survivors, and there's a concern around recruitment?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. So I think this is definitely a common concern, and we're hearing about it more and more, not just with domestic violence agencies, but group homes and things like that. And I think it's important to remember, and when we do training on trafficking, how I often frame it is trafficking exists because poverty exists, and traffickers are seeking out people who have vulnerabilities or who are lacking something, whether that's a job or safety or support or education. And then the trafficker or abuser comes along and tries to fill that gap. So if they're lacking a job, the trafficker's coming along to say, I have a job for you. If they're lacking love and support, perhaps the trafficker is coming in faking a romantic relationship and trying to court that person. And so it makes sense that a domestic violence shelter would be a recruitment place for traffickers. But what we know is people who've experienced these sorts of traumas and have these vulnerabilities are capable of being recruited anywhere. And so I highly recommend, as a staff, thinking about how are you talking to your survivors about what their rights are? How are you making their safety plan? How are you educating them about the victimizations that they've experienced? Make sure they understand their rights as a victim and their rights in the United States. You know, you have a right to make a livable wage and minimum wage. You have a right to, you know, all of the labor rights that are afforded to people. That's an opportunity to teach them about it so they can be empowered if they are recruited outside of your shelter or anywhere in the community. And then lastly, build rapport with them so that they can trust you, so that they feel comfortable sharing with you, hey, there is this person outside and they said this to me, or I was uncomfortable when this happened, to alert staff of it happening. But if they don't trust the organization, they may not speak up and share that with you. So those would be my kind of quick and immediate answers to that.
Thank you, Darcy. The next question that we have is for Peg. And so thinking about shelters, domestic violence shelters, how can they begin to manage rules or policies, especially around behavior from a survivor that they feel is problematic? So maybe thinking about substance use or not participating in required programming, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, it's common for shelters to want to put rules in place in sort of a knee-jerk fashion when there's been problematic behavior from one particular resident. In fact, I heard one program once talk about Sally's rules, which were rules that had been instituted because, you know, a resident that they sort of jokingly referred to as Sally had misbehaved at one point in time. And so a lot of times shelters end up with a lot of rules that really don't make a lot of sense in the context of their resident population, because the rules that they have were developed out of a particular problem that happened years ago. And so it's often really healthy to just sit down with the rules of the shelter program and look at what you have and whether it makes sense in the context of the program, and really consider how much effort it takes to enforce the rules that your program has in place. And if you're thinking about instituting new rules in response to something that you think is problematic, you know, asking yourself the same question and your staff in particular, like, is this something that's enforceable? Does it make sense in the context of our program? Are we using the most trauma-informed, survivor-centered approach? And will this rule enable us to do that? In fact, it would be really healthy to sit down with your current residents and talk with them about the rules and whether they think they make sense. Because you may find out that they don't feel that those rules are necessary for their own safety or their ability to get along as a community.
Great, thank you, Peg. The next question is for Sean. There's a question around how do we, and I think by we it's anti-trafficking programs, begin to have the conversations or hold shelters accountable for providing culturally appropriate services. So how can we collaborate with domestic violence shelters to make sure that the services that are being provided are culturally appropriate?
Sure. So, I mean, the cultural really not just mean ethnicity, not just mean like the race, but also the culture has like multidimensional pieces. So there are like genders, the rituality, the spirituality. So when we're talking about how to use a cultural sensitive lens, we really need to not just looking for the language itself, but also look at the different identities of like the client associate themselves with, right? So when in terms of the rules and policies we created is more general, but how we communicate with our clients and how we approach that makes a difference. I think the first thing, like I have to say, the language, the using interpreter services is very important to, at least we have to understand what they're trying to communicate and how to better support them. And then second is like we really have to think about the context of the conversation. Sometimes using interpretation services may not be trauma, like may help us to understand what they're trying to say, but the interpretation or interpreter is not like trauma informed in terms of the language they're trying to translate. So when we are working with the survivors, we oftentimes we wanted to provide trainings to the interpreters, and then in the state like coalition meetings and also other committee meetings, we offer the opportunities to provide trauma-informed approach to interpreters. The other things is how we really train our shelter staff or train our service providers using a trauma-informed and culture-sensitive approach. Couple of things we have been doing is to trying to use the voice of the survivors and then use like their language to help us understand the context of their what they're trying to communicate. So so like I think that policies, when we are creating certain policies or when we are making certain protocols, that language should be valued in those cases.
Great, thank you so much. And finally, we have a question. Darcy, if you could start us off, but Peg and Sean, feel free to jump in. Is for those domestic violence shelters who are interested in expanding services to include survivors of human trafficking and serving them, how can they go about getting buy-in from shelter staff, especially addressing biases that may exist, either from the staff or from clients towards human trafficking and or human trafficking survivors?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. And so again, I think kind of my top of mind answers come down to training. Like I shared about the Center for Prevention of Abuse, one of our partners, I will say they were already pretty much bought in, but what really was striking to me was once they received the training to really highlight how these issues intersect, they realize they're already serving these people. It's not, they don't need to really go very far to find this population. And so it was easier to kind of bring everyone together to say, we're already serving them. How can we do it better? How can we bring more resources to them with this opportunity? There's some great tools out there around the power and control wheel, which is very well known in the domestic violence world. But there's one that is pretty much the same exact thing, but in the context of trafficking. And so if you understand power and control in a domestic violence situation, you should understand the overlap and the need, or how trafficking takes place. And then in terms of implicit bias, I think not even just with this topic, I think it's a bigger kind of issue with staff, is just to bring in training. And I think someone in the chat box shared that they do this with their staff, so perhaps she could be a resource. But do training around this. How do we overcome our biases, not just here, but in general? And then lastly, especially in smaller communities, I've heard folks say, if not us, then who? If we can't provide these services to trafficking survivors, who's going to do it? Who's equipped? Who has the knowledge to serve this population? And so having those dialogues with staff may increase buy-in.
Great, thank you so much. So we want to thank all of our panelists, Darcy, Peg, and Sean. You all have been absolutely wonderful and helpful in being able to address the effective collaboration between anti-trafficking programs and domestic violence programs in shelters. We want to again remind you that we are going to be having a follow-up technical call, assistance call in April. And so just look out for a follow-up email that we're going to be sharing in the next week, which will include a recording of this call, of this webinar, in addition to some of the resources that were shared, including the guide which we just put in the chat box on working with domestic violence programs. And also there's going to be an attachment on that email with funding opportunities. If you are looking for providing some potential services for anti-trafficking programs and survivors, specifically, we will be sharing that so you can see what kind of resources there are for funding, since we know that could be a potential limitation. We will also be putting up a survey right now that will come up in your chat box. We want to know what was useful to you during this call and what we can improve. And so please give us your feedback. It's extremely useful for us. And definitely reach out. You can reach us at freedomnetworkusa.org. You can reach us on our website, freedomnetworkusa.org, or the email is training@freedomnetworkusa.org. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. Again, look for that follow-up email, and we will be talking to you all again in the next month. Thank you so much.